It was supposed to be a perfect Sunday afternoon. The Johnson family fired up the grill. Kids were laughing in the backyard, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Everything seemed peaceful until the unexpected happened. Their neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, known for her sharp eyes and even sharper complaints, glared across the fence, unimpressed. She had called the cops on them before for minor things, and today was no different. A patrol car pulled up moments later, with two officers stepping out, ready to investigate. The family froze as tension filled the air. Mrs. Whitaker stood on her porch, arms crossed, confident that the barbecue would be shut down immediately. What she didn't know was that today wouldn't go as planned. The officers walked toward the father, prepared to question him, until they suddenly recognized him. The new police chief, fresh on the job, stood calmly in front of them, waiting. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, eyes darting between the officers, the father, and the neighbor. What would happen next? Mrs. Whitaker wasn't expecting this asterisk twist. No one was. Stay tuned to see how this backyard barbecue takes an unforgettable turn. The officers exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had just walked into a situation far more complicated than a simple noise complaint. Chief Harris stood firm, his calm demeanor hiding the simmering tension beneath the surface. His kids peeked around the corner of the house, sensing something was off, while his wife stood nearby, trying to read the officers' reactions. Mrs. Whitaker, however, wasn't backing down. She stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Officers, are you just going to stand there? This family's always causing a ruckus." She was used to getting her way, and today she expected no different. But something in the air felt different this time. Chief Harris gave a polite smile, his eyes steady. "Good afternoon, officers. Anything I can help you with?" His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words. The officers hesitated, caught between their duty and their respect for their boss. Mrs. Whitaker looked confused. It was clear she had no idea who she was talking to, or the power shift that had just occurred. As the tension built, neighbors started peeking out from behind curtains, curious about the unfolding scene. What would happen next? Mrs. Whitaker was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. The tension grew thicker as Chief Harris stood his ground, his calm but commanding presence keeping everyone on edge. The officers shuffled awkwardly, unsure how to proceed. They weren't about to argue with their new boss in front of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitaker's eyes darted between the officers and Chief Harris, her frustration bubbling over. "I've had enough of this nonsense," she snapped. "It's about time someone put a stop to these constant disruptions." She glanced at the officers for backup, but they remained silent, their eyes fixed on Chief Harris, waiting for his lead. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. A few curious neighbors wandered onto their porches, whispering amongst themselves, while others watched from behind half-drawn curtains. The barbecue smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the growing sense of uncertainty. Chief Harris took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Whitaker, but I suggest we handle this with a little more conversation and a little less panic." His words were deliberate, leaving just enough room for interpretation. Mrs. Whitaker crossed her arms, unwilling to back down so easily. The officers shifted uneasily. The question remained, how far was she willing to push this? Mrs. Whitaker took a deep breath, her face set with determination. She had always seen herself as the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood's order, and backing down wasn't in her nature. "Conversation," she said with a sharp laugh. "We've tried that before. I've called about their noise, their kids running wild. Nothing ever changes." Chief Harris kept his composure, but a flicker of frustration crossed his face. He glanced at the officers, silently signaling for them to stay calm. His wife stepped closer, her voice steady yet kind. "Mrs. Whiteacre, we've always tried to be respectful. Today's just a family barbecue. Maybe we can all take a step back and find a way to get along." But Mrs. Whiteacre wasn't listening. Her voice grew louder, determined to make her point, completely unaware of how the situation was escalating around her. By now, more neighbors had gathered at the edges of their yards, whispering and pointing. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced at each other, bracing for what might come next. Then one of the officers leaned in toward Chief Harris and spoke in a low voice. Whatever he said made Chief Harris pause, his expression hardening. Suddenly, everything felt even more serious. The calm before the storm was over. Chief Harris' eyes narrowed as he listened carefully to the officer's quiet words. His expression shifted from calm to serious in an instant. Whatever he had just learned, it was clear things were more complicated than they seemed. He turned back toward Mrs. Whiteacre, his voice now firmer. "Mrs. Whiteacre, it appears there's more to this situation than we thought. Are you sure there's nothing else you want to mention?" For the first time, Mrs. Whiteacre hesitated. The confidence she had worn so proudly started to crack. She glanced nervously at her house, her lips pressing into a thin line. I just want peace and quiet," she said, her voice a little less steady than before. But Chief Harris wasn't convinced. He noticed the way her eyes darted back toward the window of her house, almost as if she was hiding something. The officers picked up on it too, their posture shifting as they prepared for the unexpected. Suddenly, a loud asterisk thud asterisk echoed from inside Mrs. Whiteacre's home. Everyone froze. The neighbors, who had been quietly watching, gasped. Mrs. Whiteacre's face went pale. Chief Harris stepped forward, his eyes locked on her. "Mrs. Whiteacre," he said slowly, "what's going on inside your house?" Mrs. Whiteacre froze, her eyes wide with panic. The thud from inside the house echoed in everyone's mind, raising a new wave of tension. The officers instinctively moved toward the front door, waiting for Chief Harris's signal. Chief Harris kept his gaze on her, his tone calm but commanding. "Mrs. Whiteacre, if there's something going on in your house, we can help. But we need to know what's happening, now." For a moment, it seemed like she might deny everything. Then with a shaky breath, she glanced back at her house, her voice barely a whisper. It's my nephew. He's staying with me temporarily. He's had some trouble recently. I didn't want anyone to know." Chief Harris' eyes softened just slightly, though his focus remained sharp. He nodded to one of the officers, who carefully stepped toward the door. Just as they reached it, the door swung open, revealing a young man, clearly startled and holding a box of tools. He looked confused and nervous, but not dangerous. Chief Harris assessed the situation quickly. It wasn't what anyone had expected. "Is everything okay here?" he asked firmly. The young man nodded sheepishly. "Yeah, I just dropped the toolbox. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Mrs. Whiteacre sighed, the tension finally breaking. Chief Harris gave a small smile. "Looks like it was just a misunderstanding after all," he said. But as he turned to leave, he added gently, "Mrs. Whiteacre, maybe next time we talk things through before calling the cops on a barbecue."